as well. 1 or 2 showers to the west of Scotland. To the south of that rain band, another very mild day. Highs of 18 degrees Celsius. That's 64 in Fahrenheit with a keen southwesterly breeze. As we go through Wednesday evening, then we'll continue to see this rain just trickling a little bit further southwards into northwest Wales. It stays on the mild side, a few clear spells as we go into the overnight period. And then it turns more unsettled more widely across the country through Thursday and Friday. Strong winds, the risk of some heavy rain. And as we head into the weekend, temperatures sliding away. I'll see you later.
Hi, I'm Alistair Stewart, and I really hope that you can join me here on GB News. I've been in this game for 40 years and I've made lots of friends, but I try and reflect what they think about the big stories of the day in conversation with me. That's why we call it Alistair Stewart and Friends, and you're a key part of it as well. I always get inundated with emails and messages and texts, and if they're really good, I play them back to you. 12 till 3 every Saturday and Sunday.
It is Tuesday afternoon. Hello and welcome to the Briefing PM, your fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Darren McCaffrey and this is what's coming up over the next hour on the programme. The Prime Minister has put the minimum wage up, but will tax rises, benefit cuts and inflation increasing, will it actually leave workers poor off? When speaking to Unison, the trade union, and 2 economic experts to get their analysis of that. Could Poland also leave the EU? Its Prime Minister has accused the European Union of making demands with a gun to our heads that could start World War III. We'll be speaking and going live to Warsaw about the potential appetite for a Pole exit. And low emission zones. Are they a war on car drivers or a valiant attempt to clean up our air? We'll be having a debate from both sides of the argument on that. What do you think of all of today's political news? As always, get in touch with me by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or you can tweet me at gbnews. Thanks for your company on this Tuesday afternoon. That's coming up in the next hour. But first, let's get the very latest news at just after 3 with Rosie Wright.
I'm Rosie Wright, good afternoon. This is your news at 3 o'clock. Teachers, nurses and police are among the public sector workers in line for a pay rise next year. The Chancellor will announce the change for millions of workers in tomorrow's budget. It comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increases after heavy borrowing during the pandemic. Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute told GB News that the increase in pay might mean higher taxes in the future.
It does, though, open the government up to some quite substantial financial liabilities. Of course, the government doesn't have its own money, it has our money. So that is either going to mean more debt or higher taxes in future to fund those public sector salaries. And on top of that, the fact that there could be some inflationary pressures that come out of that as well. Combine that with the minimum wage announcement, which is going to increase the minimum wage, is going to push up a lot of costs onto businesses. We're looking at a situation where yes, it may be slightly deceptive to say that wages are actually going up when the cost of living is going up at the same time.
Meanwhile, Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle has criticised the government, saying the number of pre-budget press briefings is unacceptable.
But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom.
Nicola Sturgeon has said there won't be any immediate changes to Scotland's COVID regulations. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said that while the situation has greatly improved since August, it remains fragile as we head into the winter period. Former Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson faces a 30-day ban from Parliament for breaking lobbying rules. It's after an investigation by the Parliamentary Committee on Standards into Paterson's lobbying for two companies he was a consultant for. The committee said they found an egregious case of paid advocacy. The former Cabinet Minister rejects the findings. The mother of two murdered sisters, Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, has dismissed an apology from the Met Police. The force apologised to the family for their initial response to reports they were missing, saying it was below the standard it should have achieved. The sisters were found dead in a North London park in June last year. Daniel Hussein will be sentenced for the double murder this week. New research says women serving in the UK military are at considerable risk of emotional bullying, sexual harassment and physical assault. A study published in the Military Health Journal showed that younger female officers are most likely to be subject to these behaviours. Well, the study said harassment of any kind leaves women at risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. Activists have scaled a government building in protest for animal rights and climate change. A group from Animal Rebellion, they're an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion, climbed the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs at 6 o'clock this morning. Well, they say they plan to stay there indefinitely. James, speaking to us from the side of the building, told GB News the government's priorities are wrong.
The UK government is being a public nuisance by spending £1.5 billion of taxpayer money on subsidies for the meat and dairy industry. That's an industry that is ultimately killing the planet and killing billions of animals. In the meantime, it's spending £150 million, that's 10% of that, on planting trees and similarly on alternative proteins. It goes to show the government's priorities in terms of propping up unsustainable and unprofitable industries over what's ultimately better for the public and for the planet.
Former Rangers manager Walter Smith has died aged 73. He led Rangers to 10 wins in top titles, as well as to the UEFA Cup final in 2008. In his career, he also managed the Scottish national side and Everton. The club chairman, Douglas Park, said that Walter will be sorely missed by all of us at Rangers. The Queen has carried out her first official engagement since her overnight stay in hospital last week. Well, she appeared on a screen via video link from Windsor Castle, where she's currently staying, during a virtual audience with the ambassador from the Republic of Korea. You're up to date here on GB News. I'll have the latest headlines for you in half an hour. Now, back to the briefing with Darren.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Rosie. Welcome to the programme. We're going to start with the budget. It is due to happen tomorrow, but my word, we've had almost all the details leaked, it must be said, in the last couple of days. And the Prime Minister wants us to believe, doesn't he, that wages are going up. It's core to his message to voters that after Brexit, he's turning the UK, he would claim, into a high-wage, high-productivity economy instead of a low-wage, high-immigration one. Now, labour shortages have indeed led, of course, to some better pay offers in the private sector. And now, to ensure that there is fairness, it seems that the Treasury is to lift the freeze on public sector pay increases. But will the poorest workers actually feel it in their pocket, because yesterday the Treasury confirmed that the national living wage is going to increase from £8.91 an hour to £9.50. Now, that should translate into a pay rise of more than £1,000 a year for full-time workers from next April. But with those experiencing high inflation, as well as the biggest cut to benefits in their lifetime with the end of the uplift in universal income, could they actually be worse off? Well, our first guest has been crunching the numbers, and delighted to say I'm joined by Tom Waters, who's a senior research economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Tom, good afternoon to you. You've been looking at the figures. What's your conclusion about this increase, first of all, in the living wage and the impact it could have on millions of workers?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly so. It's a pretty sizable increase, getting towards 7%, which is certainly pretty decent. You'd normally think for someone's wage to go up, but I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is inflation is pretty high at the moment. Prices are rising quite quickly, and so that tends to kind of blunt the effect of any minimum wage rise. And then, as you alluded to a moment ago, for workers who are in poorer households, who might be on universal credit or other benefits, the way that the benefit system works means that as their earnings increase, because of the minimum wage, say, they get less benefits. And so the increase in their disposable income is perhaps quite a bit less than you might have expected.
In saying that, the government in many ways are trying to almost replicate, to a degree, aren't they, the fact that in certain sectors wages are going up way higher than inflation. We can think of some hospitality jobs and indeed haulage drivers, for example. Is this an attempt, do you think, to kind of redress some of those imbalances for other workers on low incomes?
Well, the government has this commitment to raise the national living wage over the next few years up to about 2/3 or so of average hourly wages. Now, that's something that certainly, if you're on a low wage and you're able to keep your job, that's something that's clearly going to benefit you. Classically, the kind of thing that economists tend to worry about with this is that by raising the cost of hiring someone, maybe that might make it more likely for unemployment to go up. And certainly the minimum wage in the UK is heading towards a standard that by international standards is really pretty high, kind of levels we haven't really seen so much even globally. And so certainly that could be a risk, I think.
Is it a risk, though, Tom, when you look at the fact that I think we've got nearly 1 million vacancies, record number of vacancies? If anything, we've got a dearth of workers.
Yeah, at the moment, certainly there do seem to be a lot of vacancies, and at least in some sectors, labour shortages. I think the thing to keep in mind with the minimum wage is these are kind of permanent decisions about the minimum wage, whereas some of the changes that we see in vacancies, that can kind of come up and down, and some of it's obviously COVID related and will tend to kind of dissipate over time.
The other thing, Tom, that we found out today is that there's going to be a freeze, or the freeze that is in place for public sector workers is going to come to an end. What impact do you think that will have, not just on the individuals, but in terms of the overall economy and the strain on the Treasury's coffers?
Yeah, so when we look over the past decade or so, there's been fairly significant, in real terms, once we take account of inflation, quite significant cuts to public sector pay for some workers. And so perhaps it's not too surprising that with inflation heading up, the government wants to try and raise public sector pay a bit to improve retention and recruitment. There have been some concerns that to fill some public sector jobs, the government might have been struggling a bit because of lower pay. So I think that's kind of what the government is aiming for, is to try and keep those public sector wages up to help with recruitment. But as you say, obviously it doesn't come for free. And depending on exactly where the government ends up, we don't know what rates are going to be set yet. But depending on exactly where the government ends up, we'll certainly be talking potentially many billions of pounds increase in spending.
And just very finally, Tom, where does this leave us overall? Because we've seen a lot of spending commitments announced in the last couple of days, but we know there are quite significant tax rises coming down the pipeline in April too. And this is a Chancellor who says he's committed to balancing the books. Essentially, he wants to claw back some of that money that was spent during the pandemic. Have we got a sense of kind of the bigger picture, if you like?
Yeah, certainly the pandemic, part of its legacy, I think, is going to be the increase in government debt that we've seen over the past 18 months or so. And that's going to be something that we'll be paying off through higher taxes or lower spending for some time to come. As you say, the government's made a little bit of a move towards that with raising taxes, but we'll have to see whether or not further tax rises along those lines are what the Chancellor chooses to try and get the books balanced.
OK, really appreciate your thoughts and your analysis this afternoon. That's Tom Waters, a senior research economist at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, joining us. Well, what do workers, or those representing workers, make of this, particularly when it comes to the ending of that freeze on public sector pay? Well, Unison, the union, represents public sector workers. It's called the extra cash little comfort after the universal credit cut and national insurance hike. And delighted to say I'm joined by Gavin Edwards. He's the Senior National Officer at Unison. Good afternoon to you, Gavin. I mean, what is your reaction to, I suppose, those two announcements in the last 24 hours from the Treasury, both on the unfreezing, if you like, of public sector pay and the hike in the national minimum income?
Well, look, the first thing on public sector pay, there should never have been a public sector pay freeze in the first place. If we're hearing briefings now that a decision has been made that that's going to be ended, that's got to be welcome. But it has to be backed up by new money from the Chancellor to public sector employers so that they're able to pay those workers. We can't have a smoke and mirrors budget whereby the headline of ending a freeze is secured and the money doesn't arrive so that employers can pay that money. And now, on the national minimum wage increase, that, of course, is welcome. But we have to remember that that's not going to be coming in until April of next year. And in the meantime, people are suffering as a result of some higher costs that they're having in their cost of living. And there needs to be also sector support, specifically for areas such as social care, where there are chronic staff shortages and the government needs to invest.
Let's just deal with the unfreezing, first of all, of public sector pay. I mean, the government would say during a time in which lots of people in the private sector were on furlough, in which people obviously saw their incomes fall, that actually it was only right that those in the public sector, in a sense, out of fairness, didn't see their wages increase. Can you see the political argument for that?
No, I can't. The people in the public sector saw this country through the pandemic as teaching assistants, as street cleaners, as nurses, as doctors, as teachers, a whole range of different jobs. And they were working through that period. They were doing their bit for the country, and people who are working deserve to be paid. And people who continue to do a great job in our public services have to have their wages invested in to make sure that they're fairly rewarded and that we don't have the kind of recruitment and retention problems that your previous speaker was referring to.
In saying that, Gavin, talking about now moving away from the public sector to the private sector, particularly when it comes to the national minimum wage, I mean, the concern that we heard there from Tom earlier on, though, is that, you know, the more you do crank this up, and internationally the minimum wage in Britain is pretty high, and certainly will be after this increase in April, that it can be a stifle potentially to job creation.
Well, look, what we need in this country is we do need higher growth, we need higher productivity, we need investment in infrastructure. All of these things are the ingredients from changing round our economy from one that relies on low wages to one that invests in our economy and seeks to implement growth. And that ultimately is going to be the way to a recovery in the post-pandemic. The government says that it wants to level up. Well, the way to level up is to make sure that people in all sectors of the economy are seeing higher wages, because that then can be spent in their local economies and can drive additional growth.
Almost, it sounds like you're on the same page as the Prime Minister. You're making the same argument.
I wouldn't go that far. Because, not least on the issue of public sector pay, we've got to see delivery. Now, this is a government that has gained a reputation for securing headlines such as "we're going to fix social care," but then that's not backed up by the substance of what they've actually announced. And so on public sector pay, they're saying we are going to end the public sector pay freeze. Well, what's the reality of that? Ultimately, that's what public sector workers are going to be interested in, is whether or not the reality of a wage rise that will make a difference to their lives and their families' lives is going to be delivered. And we've seen these kind of announcements before, and we haven't seen the substance. So we will reserve judgment, and that's the test for the Chancellor in his budget.
Indeed. Gavin, thank you very much indeed. Gavin Edwards there from Unison. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And of course, we'll have full coverage of the budget throughout the day here on GB News, starting at around 11:30 tomorrow morning. OK, we're going to pause on the briefing here on GB News for a couple of minutes. After the break, though, we're going to be debating whether congestion charge punishes drivers too much or whether it's important for our lungs and the environment. Also going to Warsaw in Poland with their war on the EU. But first, let's have a look at the weather on this Tuesday afternoon.
Hello, an unsettled few days ahead across the UK. Some heavy rain to come over the next couple of days. Windy for all of us, but it is staying pretty mild out there. Let's take a look at the pressure pattern. You can see very tightly packed isobars bringing the winds from the southwest, so from a mild direction. But as we go through Wednesday and Thursday, it's this weather front that we're keeping close eyes on. That's going to bring some heavy rain, and we've got weather warnings in place. That rain is currently situated across parts of Scotland, and that's going to gradually trickle its way southwards as we go through Tuesday evening and overnight, becoming quite persistent then across parts of northwest England into southwest Scotland. A rain warning in force here. But these are your overnight temperatures as we start Wednesday morning. These are more typical of what we should be seeing by daytime at this stage in October. So some heavy rain through the morning going to be pushing its way in. Persistent as well, some difficult travelling conditions and the risk of some flooding as that rain starts to accumulate through the day. To the south of it, it's very mild, a few breaks in the cloud to the east of the Pennines, across parts of southeast England as well. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud around, but highs of 18 degrees, 64 Fahrenheit, exceptionally high for this time of year. A few showers also coming in across western Scotland. Now that rain continues to track its way slowly south and eastwards as we go through Wednesday night, becoming more persistent across Wales then through Thursday. So we have a rain warning developing here through the day. As I say, we could see a large amount of rain piling up over the next few days. Still very mild though as we start Thursday morning, 12 to 14 degrees, but a little bit cooler up towards the northwest where we see some clearer skies. Then through Thursday, it's a case of spot the difference. Further wet weather to come across these western areas, only slowly making its progress eastwards through the day. Some brighter spells elsewhere and a few showers. Staying unsettled then as we look towards the weekend. Temperatures coming down on Saturday. Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Alistair Stewart, and I really hope that you can join me here on GB News. I've been in this game for 40 years, and I've made lots of friends, but I try and reflect what they think about the big stories of the day in conversation with me. That's why we call it Alistair Stewart and Friends, and you're a key part of it as well. I always get inundated with emails and messages and texts, and if they're really good, I play them back to you. 12 till 3, every Saturday and Sunday.
very welcome back to the briefing here on GB News. It is just after 3:20. Thank you for your company. Now, higher wages and productivity, good productivity, of course, are good and welcome news. But will a government-enforced higher wage economy lead to actually fewer employers creating jobs? And can the government afford the many new spending commitments that seem to have been leaked out in recent days? Well, delighted to say that I'm joined by Mark Littlewood from the IEA, who joins me now. Good afternoon to you, Mark. First of all, let's deal with this kind of the government rhetoric about trying to create a high wage, high productivity economy. As I was saying in the intro there, no one's not going to like that. The question is it possible?
It is possible, but you can't do it, Darren, just by setting the numbers. We can't, for example, set the minimum wage at £50 an hour and suddenly declare that everybody is a high-wage productive worker. So I'm a bit worried that the government are pulling exactly the wrong levers to bring it about. If we want to be a high-wage economy, the government shouldn't be focusing on making things more expensive, which seems to be actually the consequence of most of their policies. They should be focused on liberalising the market. That's how productivity rises. So I'm rather worried that although I love their destination point, who wouldn't want to live in a higher wage, higher growth, more productive economy, that they're pulling exactly the wrong levers at exactly the wrong time. You can't get there by force of political will. You can only get there by actually making the economy work better.
In saying that, it's fair to say, isn't it, when you look at the overall economy, we really have kind of stalled when it comes to productivity. I think we're kind of mid-table in the G7. France, for example, seems to be more productive than we are, quite substantially. Why is that, Mark? Why is Britain's productivity really stalled since the economic crisis, more than 10 years ago?
You're right to point out the problem, Darren, and many economists consider it to be something of a mystery. And productivity is inextricably linked to economic growth. If you're not becoming more productive year on year, you're not going to see your economy grow. You might do if you just work harder. If you work 80 hours a week rather than 40, you'll see some economic growth. But the real magic is how to make sure that each hour that you work becomes more productive. Now, what I would blame this on in the United Kingdom is we've actually slunk in towards being a relatively high-tax, high-regulated economy. This wasn't the position in the UK 20 or 30 years ago. Compared to the rest of Europe, we would have had measurably lower taxes and considerably less regulation. But if you keep jacking up tax, the total tax take in the UK is now about the highest it's been since the end of the Second World War, the highest in our lifetimes for sure. And if you keep regulating everything, then what you find is an unmotivated workforce, by and large. There's not the incentive to do the same that you might otherwise have done in the private sector. And when you have a highly regulated workforce, you have a large number of employers and employees who are spending all of their time complying with regulations, not producing. And every hour you spend complying is an hour you're not spending producing. There's a balance to be struck, for sure. I'm not saying all regulation should be thrown out the window. But the more that you make the workforce and employers and businesses comply with endless edicts, don't be surprised if your productivity levels fall. Just what we've witnessed, just as most free market economists would expect.
What would you say, or what will you take from where the Chancellor stands when it comes to the economy at the moment? Clearly, he's having to deal with a substantial amount of public spending after the pandemic, and of course a substantial amount of debt as well. But he seems to be suggesting he wants to balance the books. He wants to rein that in while committing himself to spending billions or more, for example, on health, and at the same time raising taxes. What do we take from who is Rishi Sunak as a Chancellor? How would you sum him up?
It's really interesting, Darren, because you're right. On the face of it, he will say his instincts, I believe he said at the weekend, are in a low tax direction. His instincts are to be conservative and prudent. Well, if those are his instincts, those instincts are not coming to the fore. I can barely go through an hour or two in the lead up to the budget without seeing yet another spending announcement ping up on my phone. Another £1 billion has been found for this, another £2 billion for that. You would think Her Majesty's Treasury is awash with money and can't think what to spend it on. we are on a spending spree when in fact we are in debt. So I'm extremely worried that despite Rishi Sunak's self-professed instincts to be in favour of tax cuts and prudential spending, what we're actually seeing is he can't resist rolling out yet another new announcement of yet another few hundred million for this or yet another couple of billion for that. And I'm afraid that over the long term, that is the road to rack and ruin. At some point, we've got to balance the books. The Chancellor doesn't need to do it on Wednesday, but you have to fully go back to 2001 before there was a budget in which the government ran a surplus. We've spent 20 years fully in running up deficit. And there's always a reason not to balance the books now. Now, you might think that this year is a good reason not to balance the books. We're coming out of a pandemic. But we've been hearing this for 20 years, and we haven't been in or coming out of a pandemic for 20 years. So I'm a bit worried that Rishi Sunak's self-professed instincts are not really coming to the fore. And that may well be because we've got a Prime Minister who's spendthrift as well. So I have no hope that the books will be balanced anytime soon. They certainly won't be on Wednesday. I think you probably need to look to the end of the decade before there's any prospect of the government balancing the books. And that's notwithstanding the huge liabilities we've got. My own think tank today, Darren's released a report saying that public sector pensions are being underestimated by 57 billion a year. So money is flying out of the door and I'm afraid not coming in.
Interesting, Mark, you noted that, and you're getting pings from your phone about what potentially might be in the budget or what is going to be in the budget tomorrow. It's not been announced in the Commons as it should be. It breaks, of course, established protocol. It's fair to say that Sir Lindsay Hoyle, who's the Speaker of the Commons, is pretty damn furious about all of this. Let's have a watch.
I've repeatedly stated in the clearest possible terms that important announcements should be made by the government first in this House rather than outside. I did so again yesterday in relation to the briefings issued to the media about the budget. I was disappointed, therefore, to see more stories in the media today with apparently very well briefed information about what will be in tomorrow's budget. The government just doesn't have to take my word for it. Its own ministerial code says so. When Parliament is in session, the most important announcements of government policy should be made in the first instance in this Parliament, this House. As I said yesterday, I do not have to give a reason for my decisions about urgent question applications, but in this case, I want the House, and especially the government, to be clear. If the government continues to treat this House in a discourteous manner, I will do everything in my power to ensure ministers are called here at the earliest opportunity to explain themselves. I've personally nothing against the Minister. I feel sorry for the person who's got to answer at the dispatch box. But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom. It is not done through Sky TV.
So Lindsay Hoyle there, the Speaker of the House, pretty angry, isn't he, Mark? I mean, he's right in saying it is unconventional. In the past, Chancellors might have to resign over stuff like this.
Well, I guess that's right, Darren, but and I'm very sympathetic to Lindsay Hoyle in this regard. It is definitely part of a deliberate government media strategy to give different stories to different journalists at different times, to keep in the news about what they consider to be the good news stories for days, rather than it all coming out at the parliamentary dispatch box in maybe 45 minutes or an hour. But here's the sorry truth. Lindsay Hoyle doing his very best to defend Parliament's rights there. I think the fact of the matter is the budget isn't really a parliamentary event anymore. It's a media event. My own organisation, the Institute of Economic Affairs, has been a bit worried that we've had budgets every year built up really as a media jamboree, even if delivered over the dispatch box at the House of Commons. I'm not sure we need a budget every year. If the government wishes to change taxes, it should bring forward a bill to change taxes. If it wishes to change spending on something, it should bring forward a bill to do that. So unfortunately, the way our budget has got to, which 100 years ago would have been a solemn approach to the House of Commons about how you're going to balance the books, has now actually become a bit of a partisan media scrum in which everybody's trying to spin good news stories and spin bad news stories and give the response on a minute-by-minute basis to the media. If we don't want that, then I think Lindsay Hoyle should seriously consider whether actually having an annual budget presented by the Chancellor is a sensible parliamentary procedure at all. I suspect it isn't. And if we actually abolished the budget and asked ministers to bring forward their own proposals in their own good time, that would probably be a better way of doing parliamentary business. And the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, might be happier with it too.
OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed, Mark Littlewood. There was thoughts on whether a budget should exist at all. He's the director of the IEA. Right, you're watching The Briefing here on GB News. We're back in just a couple of minutes talking about whether Poland potentially is going to war with the EU and also whether congestion charges hits drivers a little too hard. But first, let's bring you up to date with all the latest news this hour with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright. Here are the latest headlines. Teachers, nurses and police are among the public sector workers in line for a pay rise next year. The Chancellor will announce the change for millions of workers in tomorrow's budget. It comes after Rishi Sunak paused public sector pay increases after heavy borrowing during the pandemic. Meanwhile, the Commons Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, has criticised the government, saying the number of pre-budget press briefings is unacceptable.
But once again, this House will not be taken for granted. It is not right for everybody to be briefed. It's not more important to go on the news in the morning. It's more important to come here. Let's get this message across. These are the elected members that represents this United Kingdom.
Former Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson faces a 30-day ban from Parliament for breaking lobbying rules. It's after an investigation by the Parliamentary Committee on Standards into Paterson's lobbying for two companies he was a consultant for. The committee say they found an egregious case of paid advocacy. The former Cabinet Minister denies the findings. Scotland's First Minister has said there won't be any immediate changes to the country's COVID regulations. Updating MSPs on the latest COVID situation at Holyrood, the First Minister said that while the situation has greatly improved since August, it remains fragile as Scotland heads into the winter period. The Queen has carried out her first official engagement a week after her overnight stay in hospital. She appeared on screen via video link from Windsor Castle, where she's currently staying, during a virtual audience with the ambassador from the Republic of Korea. You're up to date here on GB News. You'll have a full update at 4 o'clock.
very welcome back to the briefing here on GB News with me, Darren McCaffrey, with you until 4 o'clock. Now, yesterday, London's low emission zone, or ULEZ, expanded by 18 times its size. It encompasses a huge part now of the capital, from Enfield in the north to Lewisham in the south, Ealing in the west to Newham in the east. But ULEZ zones are also planned in Portsmouth, Leeds, Bradford, Bristol, Sheffield, Bath, Glasgow, Norwich and many other towns and cities up and down the country. Now, for many people who want cleaner air, they clearly are good news. Few disagree with that. But ULEZ charges, of which around £15 a day in London, is essentially a tax, of course, on car users. And some argue they hit the lowest earners the hardest. The poorer people are also more likely to drive older cars rather than pricey new electric ones, and that they face the biggest charges. Local economies, tourism and trade operating inside the zones could also be affected. What do we make of this, though? Joining me to discuss it is Celeste Hicks, a member of the organisation Mums for Lungs, and the former Conservative member of the London Assembly, Brian Coleman. Very good afternoon to you both. Celeste, let's start with you. I mean, you clearly would welcome these congestion zones. Just spell out your argument. You stand for Mums for Lungs. Just the damage, I suppose, that car pollution can do.
Yeah, I'm a mother of 3 children. I'm very concerned about the impact of air pollution on my children. We know from scientific research that poor air quality can lead to children's lungs being 5% smaller than the lungs of children who live in less polluted areas. And we know that it affects children throughout their lives. I was told when I was pregnant with my first child that I had high levels of carbon monoxide in my system when I was pregnant. And the midwife was only able to deduce that was because of the poor air quality in London where I live. So I'm absolutely in favour of this because I think it's going to make a real difference. We've seen a 44% reduction in the NO2 levels, nitrogen oxide levels, which are one of the most dangerous pollutants, since the ULEZ was introduced in central London. So I'm very pleased about this news.
In saying that, Celeste, do you understand at least the arguments that have been made that this does hit potentially poorer people a lot harder, and that is kind of unfair?
I've heard the arguments. I don't really agree with them. I mean, we know that most people in London, for the poorer people in London, are less likely to own a car. Where I live in Lambeth, 50% of people don't own a car. So that's 50% of people who are breathing in that pollution, who are not responsible for it. So actually, I don't necessarily agree with that analysis of it. Also, I mean, it's very easy to say we think that poor people own old diesel cars. We don't know that for sure. I haven't seen any research that indicates that that's true.
As you can see, we're actually joined by Emma Best. I apologise for the wrong introduction earlier on, who is a Conservative Assembly member for the London Assembly. Good afternoon to you, Emma. I mean, Celeste makes a good point there, doesn't she? That ultimately we know pollution, particularly from cars, is harmful for people's health. We know it leads to people dying earlier than they should, particularly in big cities like London. And this, while it may have an economic impact, when it comes to people's health, is surely the right decision.
Of course, and just to say, Brian Coleman is probably the most interesting character's name I've been called in a while. But yeah, thanks for that. No, I completely agree with Celeste on a number of points. But let's be clear, we need to clean up London's air quality, and I'm not trying to deny that. But that cost can't fall on the poorest in London and on the backs of the smallest businesses, and that's exactly what the ULEZ does. So I live on the other side of London. I live in Chingford. And we don't have good public transport networks. We have an older demographic of people, and we have the hospital just over the other side of the A406. And you've got older people with cars like Nissan Micras and Primaveras, and they make 1-2 trips a week. A lot of those trips are to hospital, and there's no NHS exemptions. And that's the problem here. This policy hasn't been implemented in order to protect the most vulnerable in our society that still need to get to those essential healthcare appointments, still have key worker jobs where they need to travel by car and they're travelling late at night and things like that. There's no blue badge exemption for disabled people. We had the scrappage scheme. The mayor's actually only paid out on a third of the applications for that scrappage scheme, and there's only enough money left to pay for less than 1,000 cars to be scrapped. So it's just not helping, and at the moment it is falling on the backs of the poorest. And I can assure Celeste, if she wants to come, to where I live, and I actually live on the A406 as well, so I'm very keen to clean up the air quality here. But there hasn't been enough exemption. There's not enough protection for the poorest of our society, and things like there hasn't even been a grace period this month, and people be being hammered by this, especially the elderly that aren't on computers and haven't seen as much from the telly or radio. There's a lot of people unaware of what's going on, and they're going to be hammered with fines this month. When this was rolled out in the central zone, we had a month's grace period, and that's exactly what we should have had here as well.
Celeste?
Well, I'm not here to be a spokesperson for Sadiq Khan and the Labour Party who've designed the policy. I'm just here to say that I'm very happy with it myself because I want clean air.
Yeah, so could we deal then, I suppose, with Emma's point that you live in Lambeth, which is pretty central in London, and I'm sure this is the same in places like Manchester and Birmingham where there is good public transport, or that you can walk to local amenities relatively easily. That's not true in other parts, and that should be factored in.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all at Mums for Lungs. We're for all of these solutions. I mean, we also campaign on extra public transport. We campaign on cycle lanes. We campaign on all kinds of active travel options, public information campaigns to encourage people to walk and cycle. We totally know that that's the problem, absolutely. And I'm very lucky to live where I do. And we're completely aware of that. But that doesn't negate the fact that this is also... That doesn't negate the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, this is a really great policy.
I mean, at the end of the day, we all know with every policy issue that a government or an assembly or a mayor introduced, there are always financial problems, as you say. There maybe should have been a grace period, whatever. But in the end, what we do fundamentally know is that congestion is literally a killer, and that, frankly, the government should be doing, or indeed the Mayor of London, or indeed any mayor across the country, doing all they can to prevent that. And if that means hitting some people harder than others, but to save all our lungs, that's a good thing, surely.
Look, absolutely in terms of trying to clean up air quality, but let me make this loud and clear. Cleaning up the air quality in London shouldn't fall on the backs of the poorest and the smallest businesses. If you believe that air quality in London is driven down by the poorest people that own those older vehicles that are making 1 or 2 trips to the hospital, or from small businesses that are making small, florists that are making small journeys like that, if you believe that's where the air quality is being damaged by London, I'm afraid that's the issue. And this policy doesn't tackle any of the big boys.
Sorry, Emma. Sorry, Emma, to interrupt. I would make the point that actually the very poorest people in our society actually are the people who probably live closer to roads and, frankly, don't own a car. I mean, to own a car, you're particularly in a city like London, you're not the poorest of the poor. Like, really poor people rely on public transport quite a lot. And I think they also sometimes, Celeste's point is that there are a lot of people who don't own a car but suffer the impact of this quite severely.
Absolutely, and like I say, that's to fundamentally misunderstand London. And if you live in the urban parts of London, then that's exactly what's true. But if you live in suburban London, you rely on a car to get around. When I was younger, we couldn't afford a car, and as soon as we could, we got gifted one by family. Our world opened up, and that was an older vehicle. So yes, I understand. Not everybody has a vehicle, but actually, I know what it would have meant to us to have lost that car in that stage of our lives. I remember the trips back crying with my mum because I was trying to carry 7 bags of shopping. I remember never being able to get a holiday, and that was the first time we had some freedom. A car is a great social equaliser in suburban neighbourhoods where we don't have the public transport, and that's the problem. If I was, in Lambeth where Celeste lives, I would completely understand that, public transport is what we need to do, and we could definitely have more measures like this. But whilst there are areas of suburban London where people rely on their vehicles for freedom, them for jobs, especially in key areas of work. This is just penalising them.
Just very finally, Celeste, I assume this is something, I know you obviously live in South London, but this is something you'd like to see potentially replicated in other cities around the UK.
Yeah, Mums for Lungs mostly campaigns in London, just because that's where most of us are, but we do have other people who we're working with in other cities. Yeah, I mean, we really think this is a great policy. As I said earlier on, it's seen a 44% reduction in nitrogen dioxide levels in the central zone. So we know it works. And in fact, we've spoken to some scientists from King's College in London who said it's the biggest reduction they've seen anywhere in the world in terms of air pollution. So even the scientists say it's a really great policy that works. So of course we'd like to see it in other cities. I mean, obviously it needs to be well designed. It needs to take into account the local issues. And I know for sure my sister lives in Sheffield and they don't have anywhere near the public transport that we have. And my sister would probably disagree with me about this. But I mean, all of these things have to go hand in hand. I mean, it's just not acceptable to do nothing. I agree with everything that she's raised, all the points she's raised about the issues of living outside of London. I am very sympathetic to that. But again, this is something we need to campaign with in a broader sense. It's not just about one policy or another, it's about everything.
OK. Celeste, thank you very much indeed. Celeste Hisks, there is the Mums for Lungs. We've run out of time, Emma, I'm sorry, but I think we've explored it pretty well, I would say, very well. And thank you to Emma Best there, who's a London Assembly member for the Conservative Party. Now, let's focus on the European Union for a moment and Poland, because it's got involved in a war of words and it's been dialed up quite substantially over the last week or so. The Prime Minister of the EU's sixth biggest economy yesterday accused the EU of starting World War III with Poland, saying that Brussels were making demands with a gun to our head and vowed to defend the right with any weapons at their disposal. The row is due to the EU imposing financial sanctions on Warsaw following reforms to Poland's legal system, and the EU insists that it has eroded the independence of judiciary and democracy. Well, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by George Balinski. He is a Polish political commentator and journalist. Very good afternoon to you, George. Just set aside the context of this, what has led up to this kind of war of words that we've seen between Warsaw and Brussels in the last week?
This is not the first discussion that there is between Poland and the EU. It seems that almost anything that Poland will do to change certain laws in the country will be criticized by the EU. The context is rather simple, actually, although complicated at the same time. Poland has a complicated law that was created 30 years ago after communism, and the current government is implementing certain changes. No law is perfect. There is a disciplinary chamber of judges that was created by this government 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago, and it's not functioning as good as it was supposed to be or as it was intended to be. So Poland has been working, the Polish government has been working to introduce some changes. Whether these changes are good or bad, it's a moot point. And Poland, as the country and the legal community, has a right to speak about it. But there are some people in Brussels that have not participated in that debate to an extent that I would wish for. I didn't see any people from Brussels coming to Poland, spending weeks.
Oh, and we seem to have lost George there, who was talking us through what is happening in Poland at the moment. We're going to try and get him back. But of course, the context of all of this, as he was setting out, is this row that we've seen between Brussels and Warsaw on the judiciary, with many feeling that actually Brussels has interfered too much in the domestic affairs of Poland. But for the European Union, they feel that many of the rights that should be afforded, it must be said, to EU member states and to its citizens, particularly when it comes to the independence of its judiciary, has not really been fairly played out there, and that ultimately EU law is being ignored. So it's an interesting debate. As I said, it's led to those war of words, and something that we will be covering here on GB News. We're trying to get our guest back up, but while we do, let's move on to another story today, which is about the surge in knife crime, and authorities warning of a fresh wave of terror attacks. A Birmingham mother whose own son was killed in a stabbing has told GB News bleed control kits are urgently needed across the country. Lynn Bard has fought a one-woman campaign to have the packs of heavy-duty bandages and tourniquets installed at key locations in towns and cities across the UK. This report is from our Home Affairs and Security Editor, Mark White.
Daniel went out for a night. There was some kind of altercation in the pub. It was nothing to do with him at all, and he was stabbed, and I didn't see him again.
In the 4 years since her son was stabbed and killed, Lynn Baird has fought a relentless campaign to do something positive in Daniel's memory. She is a remarkable woman who came up with the simple but highly effective idea for these specialist bleed control kits to help stem catastrophic blood loss long enough for expert help to arrive.
It's really got everything you would need. This tourniquet, obviously, I mean, for shutting off the extremities if you've got a big, serious arterial bleed.
Yep, military grade. Trauma bandage, that's for severe bleeding, you know, and practically foolproof to use as well.
Lynn believes that a simple bleed kit could have saved her own son.
There was no time. If there had been one of these kits in the pub and it had been used, we might have a different story now.
You're convinced of that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what made me carry on with this campaign.
With no end in sight to the epidemic of violent crime in many of our towns and cities, bleed control kits are now being rolled out more widely. More than 2,000 so far, with demand growing by the day. The Midlands Air Ambulance attend an average of 4 serious stabbings and shootings a week, and many more incidents where catastrophic blood loss is a key concern. Without a doubt, the Midlands Air Ambulance offers the very best critical care outside of the hospital environment, and they can get a patient to hospital in a fraction of a time it takes a land ambulance to do that. But there's no point in them even attending if a patient bleeds out before they arrive.
There you go, that was Mark White reporting from Birmingham on that story. OK, well, that's it. All we've got time for on the briefing with me this afternoon. We're not back tomorrow, actually, because we've got extensive coverage of the budget, of course. I'll be in Westminster, but Gloria DiPiero and Liam Halligan will be here for the autumn budget coverage starting at 11:30 a.m. Up next, though, on GB News, it's the afternoon agenda with Alex Phillips. But before that, let's head over to the Met Office down in Exeter for the very latest weather on this Tuesday afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.
Hello. An unsettled few days ahead across the UK. Some heavy rain to come over the next couple of days. Windy for all of us, but it is staying pretty mild out there. Let's take a look at the pressure pattern. You can see very tightly packed isobars bringing the winds from the southwest, so from a mild direction. But as we go through Wednesday and Thursday, it's this weather front that we're keeping close eyes on. That's going to bring some heavy rain, and we've got weather warnings in place. That rain is currently situated across parts of Scotland, and that's going to gradually trickle its way southwards as we go through Tuesday evening and overnight, becoming quite persistent then across parts of northwest England into southwest Scotland. A rain warning in force here. But these are your overnight temperatures as we start Wednesday morning. These are more typical of what we should be seeing by daytime at this stage in October. So some heavy rain through the morning going to be pushing its way in. Persistent as well, some difficult travelling conditions and the risk of some flooding as that rain starts to accumulate through the day. To the south of it, it's very mild, a few breaks in the cloud to the east of the Pennines, across parts of southeast England as well. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud around, but highs of 18 degrees, 64 Fahrenheit, exceptionally high for this time of year. A few showers also coming in across western Scotland. Now that rain continues to track its way slowly south and eastwards as we go through Wednesday night, becoming more persistent across Wales then through Thursday. So we have a rain warning developing here through the day. As I say, we could see a large amount of rain piling up over the next few days. Still very mild though as we start Thursday morning, 12 to 14 degrees, but a little bit cooler up towards the northwest where we see some clearer skies. Then through Thursday, it's a case of spot the difference. Further wet weather to come across these western areas, only slowly making its progress eastwards through the day. Some brighter spells elsewhere and a few showers. Staying unsettled then as we look towards the weekend. Temperatures coming down on Saturday. Bye-bye.